Hello, I'm James, and this is a brief introduction to the Working in Oils class, which starts on Thursday afternoon. I'm delivering in conjunction with ArtsLink. So I'm going to be talking about the materials, basic materials we're going to need, and the setup, the studio setup we need to create for the best possible effect. So let's have a little run through it. Here we can see the basic materials and tools that we're going to need. To start off with, a palette is really important. This is a wooden palette that you rest on your arm, thumb goes through there, and then we can hold different brushes while we're working and mix our paints as we go along. Now, this is a big palette. You can use a smaller palette, but we want a palette that's kind of in keeping with the size that we're working on. So a smaller palette like this, you can't mix as much paint on it, which means a surface much bigger than this means we're going to have to keep cleaning the palette. We're going to lose colours that we might want to keep. So a big palette is a great idea. Some people use a tear-off palette. Some people like to have a desktop palette, which is what I'll be using when I'm demonstrating, just for the sake of you being able to see what's going on. But that's where everything happens. Secondly, tools. These are quite cheap brushes, they're nothing fancy here, but they have the qualities that we need in order to make the kind of marks we want to make. I'm using long flats here, it's one of my favourites, but they've got two qualities. They're soft, so they're bendy, nice and easy to bend, which means I can make a long stroke, and they haven't got spare hairs hanging off all over the place, so I can make a neat stroke. So I've got one large brush there, that's a 10, that's perfectly fine for most purposes. And then I've got an 8 and a 6, and I'll complete whole paintings just using these brushes. But if you do like a bit of detail, a small round wouldn't go amiss. But that's really all you need. Now, I might use more brushes when I'm painting, but they'll tend to be duplicates. I've got another 6 here. I've got a few other different types of brushes and different shapes that I might use, but the basic sizes and the basic functions are the same. There's another long flat there. Last of the tools is a palette knife. This is an angled palette knife, and it's just for mixing paint on the palette, so we can mix a larger quantity of paint than we would be able to with a brush. So if we want to make more than a couple of brush marks, we need to mix more than a brush's worth of paint. Brush mixing will happen later on in the painting, but getting used to using the palette knife, mixing decent quantities of our core colours, really helpful. So make sure you've got a palette knife. If you've got a flat palette knife like that, that's also fine. If you've got a very small one, that means you'll mix very small quantities of paint. So thinking about the areas you need to cover, that small palette knife isn't really good for much except for actually making marks on the surface. The paint and the thinners next. Now the paint I've got here is just a core setup. So here are basically white and my primary colours. Now these can vary from one palette to another, but having a core colour that you use is really helpful. So white, will need more white than anything else. We use lots of that. I'm using a cadmium yellow here, but a lemon yellow is also fine. I like to use this sometimes. I've got a cadmium red here, but I quite often like to add in alizarin crimson. That's a useful thing. You can see that on the palette here. That's the alizarin crimson, and that's the cadmium red right next to it. And I've got ultramarine, which is a good mixing blue. Let's put a full tube out there, just for the sake of appearances. Great mixing blue, so you can mix lots of different blue qualities of colour without having to vary from this. But sometimes I use a cobalt blue, and sometimes I'll add in a viridian green to my palette. I might also add in raw umber. Burnt umber is also popular, especially for mixing blacks. So this and that blue makes a nice warm black. Yellow ochre, popular colour, good earth colour. But these are sort of all add-ons to this core I've got here. So if all you've got is a few colours like this, that's absolutely fine to start with. And to be honest, we want to limit ourselves to begin with and only add in other colours when we need them. So let's get those together and we'll be good to go. Now the other things are thinners, mostly for cleaning brushes. That's just white spirit from the hardware store. And a pot to mix it in for cleaning your brushes in. The other thing is medium. Medium and thinners are different things. This is linseed oil. It's rather a lot of linseed oil, you don't need that much. And a little pot to put it in, just a little bit at the bottom, just for dabbing the brush in or the tip of the knife. And that will loosen the paint up and make it a bit more slippy. We'll cover all of this in more detail when the class actually starts. The final thing to have a look at, in terms of materials, let's have a zoom around, is surfaces. So here's 3 different sizes of canvas panel. You can also use stretched canvas, like this. That's fine. That's on a stretcher. They'll behave slightly differently to one another. Again, we'll discuss that in greater length, but that's the biggest I think we'd need for anything we're doing in this class. So that's 16 by 20 inches. If you're metric, that's about 40 by 50. That's 12 by 16, that's 30 by 40 kind of thing. And that's 10 by 12, which is 25 by 30. This is a good size, this medium one is a good size for making a painting on. The last thing to look at here is the studio setup. Here I've got my studio easel and I've made this little platform. That's mostly so that I can film stuff as I'm going along. So that should appear nicely on the camera for you for when I'm demonstrating. But you may prefer to stand, hold a palette when you're standing, which I like to do. You might be working on a tabletop, in which case a table easel, which could even be makeshift, it doesn't have to be something simple like this, perfectly fine. We want our canvas facing us, we don't want it flat on a table going away. If it is flat on a table, you kind of want to be standing above it. But what it's going to do is, if you're working from life, which we will be in the class, you're going to lose a certain amount of the field of view by having to constantly adjust. And you'll notice what I've got here is the fundamental value of the setup, which is a single field of view that contains everything. It contains the palette, it contains the canvas, it contains my subject matter, which will go here. Now, added into that, because this is an online class, is whatever device you're using. This is a laptop from the 1930s. That needs to be able to see your canvas and your palette ideally, and hopefully you. So it might be further away, but that's okay. The important thing with this setup is the light is behind it. If it's looking at a bright window, that can throw the camera off in terms of what it can see in terms of colours and tones and that sort of thing. So if you can put it with the light behind it, that's great. If you're in a conservatory or something, there's light everywhere, that's fine. There's plenty of light in the room, so it won't really be a problem. And that's your setup. If we can get all of this together for the first lesson, then we can get painting, we can start having some fun working in oils, and developing some processes and trying it all out, having a bit of a play with it all. So I very much look forward to doing that with you, and I'll see you on Thursday afternoon.